Move, you great lump, before I have you turned out with nothing but the shirt on your back." The riding crop cracked against the top of the garden wall an inch from Cuthbert's ear, and he did not flinch, because a man who had knelt in mud since first light learned to be a thing that weather happened to. He kept his hands in the soil. Above him, mounted on a grey mare that had cost more than most men saw in 10 years of honest labour, sat a gentleman in bottle green who did not know him, and that was precisely as Cuthbert wished it. To Sir Reginald Corvish he was a bent back in a coarse brown coat, a nobody in the dirt, the gardener who had been slow to clear the path so that a fine horse might pass. That was the whole of it, that was the point. Do you hear me, fellow? Or has the sun cooked what little wit you were born with? "I hear you, sir," Cuthbert said in the low, roughened voice he had worn now for 3 weeks, and he shifted the barrow of cut roses off the gravel so the mare might have her clean passage. He did not lift his eyes. He had learned that too, that the surest way to remain invisible was to look at no one, for the gentry of the county mistook a lowered gaze for a lowered soul, and once a man was beneath their notice he was free to observe them entire. And he had observed a great deal, these 3 weeks in the gardens of his own estate. He had come home to Sablebury Hall a fortnight before the harvest, and instead of riding up the great avenue in his own colours, he had turned his horse aside at the lodge, sent his valet on ahead with instructions to say nothing, and walked into the servants' yard, as a man seeking work. Old Peveril, the head gardener, knew him, of course. Peveril had put a trowel in his hand when he was 6 years old and taught him the Latin names of things while his father raged in the great house, and Peveril had wept a little and said nothing and given him a coat. So Cuthbert, 9th Duke of Sablebury, master of 40,000 acres, of coal in the north and ships on the water and a seat that had returned members to Parliament since before the Georges, had spent 3 weeks on his knees among his own roses, and no one who mattered had known his face. There was a reason for it, and it was not a game. His father had died in the spring, a hard man, a cold house. A boyhood spent learning that affection was a coin other people spent to get something from you, and with the old Duke's death had come the letters, dozens of them. Mothers with marriageable daughters, fathers with debts, cousins he had never met who suddenly recalled a deep and tender kinship. A woman he had danced with twice in London had written to remind him, with exquisite delicacy, that certain expectations had been formed. The whole of England, it seemed, had looked at the new Duke of Sablebury, unwed, 36, richer than sense, and seen not a man but a prize to be closed upon. He had read the letters in the cold library where his father had died, and something in him, some lost warm thing that had survived a loveless boyhood, had simply gone quiet and hard. He had trusted a woman once, at 24. Her name did not matter now. What mattered was that she had wept prettily at his side for the better part of a year, and, when a marquess with a larger fortune had offered for her, had confessed to a friend who took pains that Cuthbert should hear it, that she had never been able to abide the coldness of him, but that a dukedom in waiting warmed a great many things. He had believed her tears. That was the shame of it, the thing he could not forgive himself, that he, who prided himself on missing nothing, had missed the whole of her. He had resolved that year that he would never again be a fool for a soft look, and he had kept the resolution so faithfully that men now called him the Iron Duke, and meant it as a warning to their sons. So he had come home in a gardener's coat to see, for once, what the world was when it did not know it was being watched by a duke. He would see who was kind to the man in the dirt and who was not. He would learn, at last, the shape of the county's true heart. The daughters brought to the hall to be paraded before a duke who would not show his face, the mothers who schemed, the friends who fawned. He would watch them all be cruel to a nobody, and he would know them. He had not expected to find so much cruelty so easily. That was the first lesson. Sir Reginald wheeled his mare away without another word, spattering Cuthbert's coat with wet gravel, and rode up toward the hall where the great house party had been gathering all week, for the estate's steward, in the Duke's unexplained absence, had had no choice but to let the invitation stand, and so 40 of the county's finest had descended upon Sablebury to be entertained by a host who was, unbeknownst to them, weeding the borders 40 yards from their windows. Cuthbert straightened, pressing a fist into the small of his back, and looked at the smear of grey mud drying across the front of his coat. He had been struck at, sworn at, stepped over, and spoken of as though he were deaf 100 times in 3 weeks. A footman had emptied a basin of dirty water across his boots and laughed. 2 young ladies of good family had discussed, not 4 feet from where he pruned, precisely how much they hoped the absent Duke's fortune ran to, and whether his reputed coldness might be endured for the sake of it. One need not love a bank, one of them had said, and the other had laughed like a bell. He had pruned the rose and said nothing and felt the old iron settle deeper into him. Yes, just so. I was right about all of it. And then, on the 9th day, the young woman had come with the water. He thought of her now because it was near noon, and near noon she came. He had not learned who she was at first, only that she was not one of the fine guests. Her gown was a plain grey stuff, mended at the cuff with small careful stitches, and her bonnet had seen more than one summer. She walked out from the direction of the kitchen court with a tin cup and a stone jug, and on that first day she had stopped beside him where he knelt sweating in the full glare of the sun, and she had said, "You'll do yourself an injury, working through the heat of the day with nothing to drink." Here, no one had brought Cuthbert of Sablebury a cup of water in his life without wanting a duchy for it. He had looked up, startled out of his careful stillness, and seen a young woman of perhaps 24 with a plain, clear, quiet face and eyes the colour of weak tea and river stones, and she had held the cup out to him as though he were a man and not a thing that weather happened to. He had taken it. The water was cool. She had drawn it fresh. She had not lingered to be thanked, only nodded once and gone on toward the still room with her jug, and he had knelt there in the dirt holding an empty tin cup and feeling something shift in him that he did not have a name for and did not want. She had come every day since. Never with a word too many. Sometimes only the water and a nod. Sometimes a small remark about the weather, or the roses, or the swallows massing on the stable roof for their leaving. She did not know his face. She did not know he was rich. She had nothing whatever to gain from a bent old gardener in a muddy coat, and still she came, and the coming had become, God help him, the hour he waited for. Today she came a little late, and today she was not alone, and today Cuthbert learned who she was. He heard the voices before he saw them, a bright, carrying feminine voice pitched to be overheard, and under it the quiet one he had come to know. He rose from the border and stepped into the shadow of the yew hedge. A gardener make himself scarce and watched. Eloan Ingle. For he would learn the name within the minute, and would not forget it after, came along the gravel walk with the tin cup in her hand and her eyes down, and a step behind her, in a gown the colour of a sunlit peach, and a good deal too much lace for mourning, came a young lady he had marked already as the reigning beauty of the house party. Millicent Brandreth. He knew the name. Her father's land marshed with his own to the east, and her mother had written him 3 of the letters. She was handsome in the hard, finished way of a woman who has been told of her handsomeness since the cradle, and she moved through the world as though the world had been swept clean for her passage. "There now, do stop, I am speaking to you," Miss Brandreth said, and closed her gloved hand on the girl's arm to halt her. "I merely wish to understand the arrangement of the household, since it seems no one else can tell me plainly. You are the poor relation, are you not? The cousin they took in out of charity. Ingle, yes. Your mother married beneath her and died of it, and your father drank the rest, and now you fetch and carry for your keep. Have I the whole of the sad little tale?" Cuthbert, in the shadow of the yew, went very still. "You have most of it, Miss Brandreth," Eloan said. Her voice was level, neither wounded nor sharpened, the voice of a woman reciting a thing she had long ago made her peace with. She did not pull her arm away, and she did not lower her head any further than it already was, which was to say she had not lowered it at all. "My mother did marry for love, and buried it too young, and I have never once thought the worse of her for the bargain. She had 5 good years. I have known people with 50, and nothing half so warm to show for them. For love." Miss Brandreth said the word as though she had found it on the sole of her slipper. "How touching. And where has love housed you?" "In the still room, mending other women's linen." "Do you know, I think it a kindness to be honest with a creature in your position. You will spend your life at the edges of rooms like these, carrying water, and it is far better you should understand that now than nurse some foolish hope above your station. There is nothing so pitiable as a poor woman who forgets she is poor." She released the arm at last with a little push and smiled her finished smile. I say it entirely for your good. That is generous of you, Eloan said, to spend so much thought on someone so far beneath your notice. It was said so gently that Miss Brandreth took it, for a moment, as agreement. Cuthbert saw the flicker of confusion cross the beautiful face, the small hunt for the insult that had certainly been there and could not quite be located, and then the girl in grey inclined her head, perfectly civil, and turned and walked on toward where the roses grew, leaving the beauty standing on the gravel with her mouth slightly open and no answer in it. Cuthbert found that he had stopped breathing. He let it out slowly. He had watched 40 of the county's finest for 3 weeks. He had catalogued their cruelties and been satisfied by them, because each unkindness was another brick in the wall he had built, another proof that he had been right to trust no one, right to come home in a coat of lies, right to keep the last warm thing in him locked in a cold, dark room. And here was a girl with mended cuffs, who had every reason for bitterness and carried none, who had been told she was nothing and had answered without heat and without a single flattering word, and who now, he watched her come, was walking straight toward the muddy old gardener in the shade of the yew with the tin cup in her hand, as though the last 5 minutes had not cost her anything at all. "You've had a long morning of it," Eloan said, stopping before him. She had drawn the water fresh again. He could see the cool sweat on the tin. "And a hard one from the look of your coat. Sir Reginald, was it? He rode past me at the gate with a face like weather." She held out the cup. "Drink. There's no one watching but the swallows, and they think the worse of all of us." Cuthbert took the cup. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady, and he was grateful for the mud on them that hid it. "You needn't trouble," he said, in the roughened voice. "A man in my place is used to being ridden past. No one ought to be used to it." She said it simply as a plain fact of the world, and looked at him, really looked, the way no one at the great house had looked at the gardener in 3 weeks, the way, he thought with a jolt. No one had looked at the Duke either, for they looked at the fortune and the title and the cold famous face, and never once at the man behind them. "You've kind eyes, for all you keep them down," she went on. "I've noticed it. You watch everything and you say nothing, and I've thought once or twice you see more of this house than the fine folk who own the deeds to it." He nearly told her then. He felt the truth rise in his throat like water in a jug. "I am the man who owns the deeds. The house is mine and the roses are mine, and I have been kneeling in my own dirt to learn the hearts of my own guests, and I have learned yours, and it has undone me." And he swallowed it whole and drank the water instead, because he had built the wall too well and too long to breach it for a soft look, even one that seemed, for the first time in a dozen years, to have nothing at all it wanted from him. That was the danger of her, he understood, standing in the shade with the cool cup in his ruined hands. Not that she flattered. The fortune hunters flattered, and he was armored against flattery. It was that she did not. She had knelt to no one and asked for nothing, and been kind to a nobody in the dirt, when kindness bought her precisely nothing, and against that Cuthbert of Sablebury, who had thought himself proof against every human warmth, had no armor at all. "Thank you," he said, and handed back the empty cup, and their fingers did not quite touch, and he was aware of the not touching as a man is aware of a held breath. "There now. That's the first time you've thanked me and looked at me while you did it." Eloan smiled, a small, plain, real smile, the first he had earned, and turned the cup in her hands. "Peveril says you're only taken on for the season, that you'll be gone with the leaves. I hope that's not so. It's a better garden for having someone in it who cares what becomes of the roses." She tucked the empty cup against the jug. "Mind, Sir Reginald, and mind the heat. I'll come again tomorrow." She went, grey against the green, back toward the still room and the mended linen and the long life at the edges of rooms that the beauty had promised her. And Cuthbert stood among his father's roses with mud on his hands, and the whole careful architecture of 3 cold weeks, 3 cold years, 3 cold decades, trembling on its foundation, and he thought, with something close to fear, "I came here to prove that no true heart existed. And there she goes, carrying water back to the house, and I have found the one thing I swore I never would, and she does not know my name, and when at last she learns it, she will learn that everything she has been kind to was a lie. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would keep to the far borders. Tomorrow he would not wait for noon. He knew, even as he thought it, that he would wait. The water she had left him had gone warm in the tin cup, by the time the household roused itself the next morning, and Cuthbert found that he had not the heart to empty it into the roots, as he would have any other. He turned the cup slowly in his earth-dark hands, watching the sun come up over the yew walk, and told himself he was a fool. A man of his years, a man who had buried tenderness so deep he had half forgotten where the grave lay, standing at dawn among the espaliered pears, and thinking of a girl who had knelt in the gravel to bring a common gardener something to drink. She had not known him. That was the whole of it, and he made himself hold to the fact the way a man holds to a rope in a current. She had seen a labourer with a torn glove and a stiff back, a man the rest of them stepped past as though he were a barrow left in the path, and she had stopped. No one stopped. In 3 months of this game of his, of the coarse coat, the borrowed name of Colt the under-gardener, the deliberate stoop that hid the breadth of his shoulders, no one at Sablebury had once looked at the man kneeling in the beds and seen a person worth a word. That had been the point. He had wanted, after everything, to know what the world offered a man who had nothing to offer it in return. The world, he had learned, offered him its back, except her. He set the cup on the wall and took up his spade, and he had scarcely broken the first spit of earth when the morning's true business arrived, announced by the crunch of many feet and the high, carrying voice he had come to know as one knows the sound of a wasp in a still room. Colt. Colt, wherever you have got to. Miss Millicent Brandreth came down the path in primrose muslin, her parasol tilted against a sun that had scarcely any strength in it yet, 2 of her friends drifting in her wake like ribbons behind a kite. She did not look at him when she reached the bed. She looked at the roses over his head, as one addresses a servant through the air above him. The white ones. My wishes the white ones cut for the breakfast room, and mind you leave the thorns on the stems this time. The last were butchered. One expects at least that a gardener can manage a rose. They'll want an hour to open properly, miss, Cuthbert said in the flat, roughened voice he had practiced. Cut now and they'll hang their heads by noon. Miss Brandreth's laugh was a small, cool, practiced thing. I did not ask you to instruct me on the habits of flowers. I asked you to cut them. Or is that beyond you as well? She had a way of making the word you sound like a thing found on the sole of a shoe. He inclined his head. The whole art of the disguise was in that inclination. The swallowing of a lifetime's answer, and reached for the shears, and he thought not for the first time of what her face with she knew that the man she was ordering about the beds was the very Duke of Sablebury whose favour she had come 60 miles and stayed a fortnight to win. For that was why they were all here. His steward Halloway had arranged the whole insufferable house party in his master's name and his master's supposed absence. The Duke detained in town, the guests to make free of the gardens and the lake and the long gallery until he should deign to return, and it was universally understood, choose a bride. He was 36 and without an hair. And the county had decided he could not be trusted to arrange the matter alone, and so they had sent their daughters, and Miss Brandreth was the sharpest of them, the one who laughed most prettily and cut most deeply and had already, in the servants' hearing, described the estate as though the deeds were signed, cut her roses. He handed them up thorns and all, and she took them without thanks and was already turning when the other voice came. You've left the finest one. Elowen Ingalls stood a little apart on the path, a basket of cut lavender on her arm, and she was not speaking to Miss Brandreth. She was speaking to him. She came a step nearer and pointed, not at the perfect blooms Miss Brandreth had chosen, but at a single half-open rose low on the bush, its outer petals faintly bruised, the sort of flower any gardener would pass over. That one, she said. It's the sweetest of them. The bruised ones always are. They've had to work harder to open. It seems unfair to leave it because it isn't tidy. Cuthbert looked at the rose, and then he looked at her, and the guard he had kept whole for 3 years slipped its bolt by the width of a hair. Miss Brandreth turned back with her cool laugh already loaded. Miss Ingle has opinions on roses, how charming. I had not known one learned horticulture in a curate's back parlour, but then you would notice the shabby ones, I suppose, like calls to like. Her friends tittered on cue. It was a neat little cruelty, delivered with a smile, and it named the whole of Elowen Ingalls' position in the house in a single stroke. The poor relation of a poor relation, invited to the party only to make up the numbers and to serve, by contrast, as the plain grey ground against which the primrose muslins might shine. He had heard the story in the servants' hall. Orphaned, portionless, kept by a distant cousin who resented the keeping, here on sufferance and reminded of hourly. Eloan did not flush. She did not drop her eyes, which he had half expected and would have understood. She simply looked at Miss Brandreth with a calm that was somehow worse for the other woman than any blush could have been, and said, "Perhaps it is that. I've never had much that was new or fine, so I've learned to see what's worth keeping in things that aren't. It's a useful eye. It saves one a great deal of disappointment." She smiled then, without a grain of malice in it, which robbed the words of any sting a listener might report and left only their weight. "The lavender your aunt asked for is cut. I'll carry it up myself. I think it does bruise so, in careless hands." And she went, unhurried, the basket on her arm, up the path toward the house, and Miss Brandreth stood a moment with her thornless roses and her opinion visibly rearranging itself, and Cuthbert bent very low over the rose bush, so that none of them should see what had come into his face. He cut the bruised rose. He did not know why he did it, except that he could not leave it there after what she had said of it. He cut it and turned it in his fingers and found she was right. It was the sweetest of the lot. The scent of it deep and warm where the perfect blooms had scarcely any at all, and he stood among the beds with the shears forgotten in his hand and understood, with the particular dread of a man who has sworn off a thing forever, and feels the old thirst move in him, that he was in some danger he had not planned for. He had planned for everything else. That was the bitter comedy of it. 3 years ago a woman with hair the colour of Miss Brandreth's had stood in his own long gallery and let him believe himself loved, had spoken of his character and his conversation and his heart with such tender particularity that he had asked her, at last past all his caution, and had heard her a week before the banns, laughing with her sister behind a door left carelessly ajar. "It is the title, of course," the sister had said. "You never mean to tell me you'd have looked twice at the man himself, that great scowling creature." And the woman he had meant to wed had answered, lightly, "One does not marry a face, one marries a duchy." Cuthbert had walked away from the door and out of the house and had not let a woman near the true grain of him since. He had built the coldness they all feared him for out of that one afternoon. And he had built this, the coat, the false name, the kneeling in the dirt, out of the single stubborn wish to stand once, just once, in front of the world stripped of everything it valued in him, and see what was left. What was left, it seemed, was a girl who thought a bruised rose was the sweetest one. The days that followed did not let him alone. He might have kept to the far kitchen gardens, out of the guests' idle range. He found instead that his work carried him, by small dishonest degrees, toward wherever the house party was not, which was, he discovered, wherever Eloan Ingle was. She kept to the edges of things, while the muslins arranged themselves prettily on the lawn for the good of any window that might hold the returning Duke. She slipped away to the wilder corners, the old physic garden gone to seed, the pond with its drowned reflection of willows, and she did not arrange herself for anyone. He watched her, over the tops of hedges, across the width of the walled garden, and he was aware that watching was its own small dishonour and could not stop. She talked to him. That was the marvel of it, that he turned over each night, in the narrow bed of the gardener's cottage he had insisted, to Holloway's horror, on keeping. She talked to Colt the under-gardener as though his opinion had a value, asked him the names of things and remembered them, brought him, twice more, water when the day was hot, and once a heel of bread and cheese wrapped in a cloth, 'cause, she said, she had noticed he did not go in at noon with the others. "You work through," she said, sitting on the low wall a careful, proper distance from him, watching him eat because he could not, without strangeness, refuse it. "Why do you not go in? I'm better let alone," he said, which was true, and rougher than he meant. He heard the rawness of it and half turned, expecting her to gather her skirts and go, as any one of the house above would have gone, glad of the excuse. "So am I," she said, and did not seem to take offence, and something in the plain agreement of it undid him further. "It isn't unfriendliness. It's only that there are places where one is asked to be a thing one isn't, and it's a great labour, keeping it up, and out here nobody asks. The lavender doesn't care whether my gown was turned twice before it came to me." "You don't care?" She tilted her head, considering him with those steady eyes. "Do you?" "No," he said, His heart was doing something painful and unfamiliar in his chest. "No, there," she said, as though a small matter had been settled to her satisfaction, and she looked out over the beds he had made, and after a while she said, quietly, not as flattery, for she plainly did not know he had had any hand in it beyond the laboring, "It's the most beautiful garden I've ever stood in. Whoever loves it must be a happier man than he lets on." He could not answer that at all. To answer honestly would have been to say that the happier man she imagined was himself, and that he had not been happy in the making of it, but only quieter, the way a wound is quieter for being pressed. That he had planted every bed she stood among in the years after the gallery and the door left ajar, driving the grief of it into the soil because the soil, at least, gave something back. He kept his eyes on the bread in his hands and let the silence be the answer, and she let it, which was its own kind of grace. She did not fill it with chatter as Miss Brandreth would have done. She only sat and watched a wren go in and out of the ivy, and after a while she rose and thanked him for the company as though he had given her something, and left him more disordered than any reproach could have. He learned the shape of her by the things she did when she thought herself unwatched. He saw her right a bird's nest a storm had tipped, standing on the very tips of her worn slippers to reach it. He saw her one evening take the arm of the old half-blind gardener Prewitt, the true gardener, in on the whole conspiracy and vastly amused by it, and walk him slowly to the gate, chattering to spare his pride, so that no one should see the old man grope for the path. She had not known Cuthbert was there. She never performed. That was the thing he could not reconcile with everything the world had taught him, that a person might be, in the unwitnessed dark, precisely and only what they were in the light, and she did not, ever, ask after the Duke. He noticed it because everyone else did nothing else. The whole house strained toward the absent master like plants toward a window. His name was the salt in every conversation. Miss Brandreth spoke of dear Sablebury with a proprietary warmth for a man she had met exactly once at a ball 4 years gone, and had described to her friend, in the rose garden, as forbidding but eminently manageable, once one is mistress of the place. But Eloan Ingle, brought 60 miles to the very foot of a duke's fortune, never spoke of him, never watched the drive, never once arranged herself against a window. When the other women fell to sighing over what the Duke might be like, she had said only, he had heard it, hidden by the box hedge, and had gone very still to hear it. "I hope, for his sake, that someone here likes him for himself. It must be a lonely thing, to be wanted for a house." She had said it lightly, and moved on, and had no notion that the man himself was 10 feet distant with a trowel gone dead in his hand and his hole guarded, ruined heart turned over in his breast like earth beneath a blade. That night he did not sleep. He sat in the cottage doorway with the cut rose, dried now, in his fingers, and he faced the thing squarely, because he had never been a coward about anything but this. He had come here to be seen without his title, and had got his wish past all bearing. One woman in all the county had looked at the man and not the duchy, had brought him water and bread, and the astonishing courtesy of her honesty, and she had done it believing him a labourer with nothing to give her. There was not a suspicion of scheme in it, because there was nothing to scheme for. It was the one clean proof he had wanted for 3 years and had never thought to find, and it had come to him wearing a turned gown and carrying a basket of lavender, and he could not, now, stop wanting to be near it, which left him nowhere good. For she was falling, he could not pretend otherwise, and it shamed him into some gentle regard for Colt under Gardner, a man who did not exist. Every kindness she showed the labourer was a stone laid on the false ground he stood on, and when he told her the truth, as one day he must, she would learn that the man she had kind to had let her be kind to a lie, that the Duke she had pitied for being wanted for a house had stood before her in a torn coat and watched her be humiliated by Miss Brandreth and said nothing, done nothing hidden. She would not thank him for the water then. She would look at him the way she had looked at Miss Brandreth in the rose garden, calm and clear and unanswerable, and she would be right too. He should end it. He should send the party away, resume his name, be the great scowling creature at the head of his own table, and let Miss Ingle back to her cousin's grudging house with nothing to remember but a garden and a gardener who was never real. That was the honourable road, and he knew it, and he sat in the doorway until the sky greyed and the birds began, and he could not, for the life that was in him, make himself take it. Instead, he watched the light come up again over the yew walk, and thought of the way she had said the sweetest ones are the bruised ones, and knew with the helpless certainty of a man past the point of pretending that he was going to go on. That tomorrow he would find some honest reason to be wherever she was, that he would drink whatever water she brought him and let it cost him what it would. He had spent 3 years learning not to look at anyone. He could not now look away from her. The morning of the garden fete arrived with a fanfare that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with his name. Cuthbert saw it long before the first carriage crested the avenue of limes, the footman laying trestles beneath the great cedar, the marquee canvas snapping white against a sky the colour of washed silk, the gardeners under hollis fussing over urns that had been perfectly well the day before. He watched it all from where he knelt at the border edge in his stained fustian coat, a barrow of clipped box at his elbow, and no one who swept past him on their way to arrange something important thought to wonder why the shabbiest labourer on the estate lingered so near the terrace steps. That was the whole of it, of course. That was why he had first put on the coat. A man grew tired of being met by his title before he was met by his face, of every smile that arrived a half-second too quickly, every deference that had a price folded inside it. In fustian he was invisible, and in being invisible he had learned more of the truth of his own house than he had gleaned in 20 years of being the Duke of Sablebury. He had meant it as a fortnight's diversion. He had not meant to find, 3 weeks into it, that he could not stop watching for one particular figure to come down the kitchen path with a tin cup in her hand. She came now, though not with the cup. Eloan carried a basket of cut roses for the tables, and she carried it the way she carried it out hurry, without complaint, as though the world had never once given her cause to expect it would go easily and she had decided long ago not to mind. She was got up no finer than usual, a gown of sprigged muslin that had been turned and re-hemmed until the original colour was a matter of guesswork, and a shawl he suspected had been her mother's. Among the arriving silk she ought to have looked a poor thing. She did not. She looked like the only real object in a room full of paintings. He bent lower over the box hedge and made himself useless with the shears so that he might go on looking. The guests spilled onto the lawns by noon, and with them came the noise he had fled, the laughter pitched to be overheard, the compliments that circled back always to the giver. He knew most of the faces, Sir Aldous Merrow, who had lost a fortune at cards and come to mend it by marriage. The Ferris sisters twinned in lavender. And at the centre, as she arranged always to be at the centre, Miss Millicent Brandreth in a confection of celestial blue that had certainly cost some poorer man his quarter's wages, her fan working the air with the idle authority of a woman who believed herself already mistress of the place. She had come, everyone understood, for him, for the Duke who did not show himself, whose absence only sharpened the general appetite. Cuthbert had heard her days past, questioning Hollis about his master's habits with a sweetness that did not disguise the calculation beneath it, and he had felt the old weariness settle over him like damp. Here was the whole machinery of his life in a single blue gown. He had watched her cross the terrace a dozen times and never once seen her look at the man clipping the hedge 4 feet from her slipper. To Millicent Brandreth he was furniture. It was almost restful. It became less restful when she found Eloan. He heard it begin before he understood it, the way one hears the first stone shift before the slope gives way. A little knot of them had gathered near the fountain where Eloan was setting the last of the roses into a silver bowl, and Millicent's voice lifted, bright and carrying, meant for the circle and for the lawns beyond it. "But how charming," she said. "I declare I have been admiring your gown this half-hour, Miss Ingle. Such an interesting shade. One so seldom sees that particular softness of colour. Tell me, is it the fashion in your part of the county to wear a thing until it forgets what it was?" The Ferris sisters tittered on cue. Sir Aldous smiled into his glass. Cuthbert felt his own hand go still on the shears. Eloan set the last rose. She did not flush, and she did not flinch, and when she straightened and looked at Millicent Brandreth it was without any of the flustered gratitude that the cruel depend upon in their prey. "It was my mother's," she said. "She wore it to be married in. I find I mind that it remembers her, even if it has forgotten the fashion." A small pause. "I hope your own gown will one day be so well loved." It landed. He saw it land, saw the fan check for half a beat in Millicent's hand, saw the colour come up under the powder, saw the Ferris sisters glance at one another, uncertain now whether they were permitted to laugh. It was not a wound. It was gentler and worse than a wound. It was the sound of a small string struck against a large false one, and everyone within hearing knew which had rung the clearer. But Millicent Brandreth had not clawed her way to the centre of every lawn in 3 counties by yielding a field so easily. She recovered, and she smiled, and she chose the crueler ground. How affecting, she said. Married in it. And your mother, I collect, is dead, said Eloan simply. 2 winters passed. Ah, Millicent's fan resumed. Then there is no one to advise you. That explains a great deal. A girl in your situation, Miss Ingle, no mother, no fortune, no name to speak of, really ought to be told in kindness that there are places a person may put herself forward and places she may not. A great house entertains all manner of people. It does not follow that all manner of people are its guests. She let her gaze travel, slow and deliberate, over the muslin, the shawl, the worn slippers, down to the basket of stems at Eloan's feet, and she made of that look a public verdict. One would not wish you to mistake charity for welcome. It is the sort of error that ends in humiliation. I say it only for your good. The circle drew breath to laugh, and this time they meant to make it stick. Cuthbert was on his feet before he had decided to be. He was not aware of choosing it. He had spent 3 weeks in this coat teaching himself that a gardener does not speak, does not lift his eyes, does not exist, that the whole use of the disguise was the silence it bought him. He knew, even as he crossed the gravel with the shears still in his fist, precisely how great a folly it was, that a labourer who put himself between Miss Brandreth and her sport would be turned off the estate by nightfall, and that he could hardly announce himself the master to prevent it without unmaking the very thing he had come out here to find. He knew all of that. He did it anyway, and the knowledge that he could not have stopped himself frightened him more than any consequence. Beg pardon, miss. He pitched his voice low and rough, tugged the brim of his hat, and made himself small in the way he had practiced, a servant intruding only from necessity. The bowl. It'll want moving to the shade, or the blooms'll be brown afore your tables are laid. Roots of the matter, that is, if you'll let me. And he stepped past Millicent Brandreth as though she were indeed furniture. As though the argument had never been an argument at all, but only a delay in the honest business of the day. And he took up the silver bowl and set his shoulder between Eloan and the circle, and by the plain physical fact that he broke the ring the cruelty had drawn. It was nothing. It was a gardener moving a bowl of roses. Yet the moment came apart in his hands, because there was nothing left for Millicent to strike at. Eloan had turned to help him with the water. The Ferris sisters had lost the thread, and Sir Aldous, sensing the sport gone flat, was already drifting toward the champagne. A cruelty needs an audience that is sure of itself. Cuthbert had, with a bowl of roses, made the audience unsure. He felt Millicent Brandreth's stare on the back of his fustian coat, affronted and puzzled, a lady insulted by an object that had presumed to move on its own. Then she gathered her skirts and her people and swept off toward the marquee to find a company that would remember to laugh when she wished it, and the fountain was quiet again but for the water. You needn't have, Eloan said. He busied himself with the bowl. Blooms don't keep in the sun. They keep well enough an hour. She was looking at him. He could feel it, the direct, unhurried attention that he had come out here precisely to be spared, and that he now found he could not bring himself to escape. You crossed half the lawn to save a basket of roses that were doing very well where they stood. I think, sir, you crossed it to save something else, and I think we both know it, and I think you would rather I did not say so. Very well, I won't. A breath. But thank you. He ought to have grunted and gone back to his hedge. That was what the coat required. Instead he heard himself say, "It was a poor rescue. I've likely made it worse for you. She won't forget being bettered by a servant. She won't forget being bettered by a beggar's daughter, either, and I could not help that one." Eloan sank down on the fountain stone lip and began, with the same unhurried care, to trim the browned leaves from the stems, making work for her hands the way he had made work for his. So we are neither of us forgiven. We may as well be unforgiven in company. She glanced up, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile and was warmer than one. Sit a moment. You've earned a rest even if I haven't given you leave to take it. and I don't imagine anyone will scold the gardener for resting where no one important can see him. No one important. She meant it kindly, meant herself among the unimportant, and had no notion she was giving the Duke of Saberbury permission to sit in his own garden. He sat. He could not afterward have said why, except that to walk away from her felt, in that moment, like a thing his body simply declined to do. They call you the quiet one below stairs, she went on, not looking at him now, her attention on the roses. Hollis's man who keeps to himself and won't take his ale with the others. They think you proud. I told them they were wrong. Did you? His voice came out more careful than he intended. And what did you tell them I was, if not proud? Tired, said Eloan. There's a difference, though it wears the same face. A proud man keeps apart because he thinks himself above the company. A tired one keeps apart because the company has cost him too much and he has none left to spend. She snipped a leaf. I didn't know which you were when I first brought you the water. You looked at me as though you were waiting to learn what I wanted for it. I remember thinking, there is a man who has been asked for a great deal by a great many people, and given it, and been thanked for none of it. She shrugged gently. So I gave you the water and asked for nothing. It seemed the only thing I had that you might not already be sick to death of. He said nothing. He could not. She had, in the plainest possible sentence, laid bare the whole architecture of his life. The flatterers, the fortune hunters, the endless outstretched hands, the reason he wore this ridiculous coat at all, and she had done it not to a duke she meant to win, but to a gardener she believed had nothing to give her. She had read him true when she thought there was no advantage in it. He had spent his whole life being seen clearly only by people who wanted something, and here was a woman who wanted nothing and saw him clearer than any of them. You're a strange sort of gardener, she said when the silence had gone on too long. You talk like a man who's read more books than he's dug beds. I read where I can, true enough. A man may better himself. He may. She set the trimmed roses back in the bowl one by one. My father meant to. He was a schoolmaster before the fever took his living and then took him. He taught me my letters and my sums and a great deal of poetry I have no earthly use for now, and he taught me that a person's quality is not the same as their station, though the world does its best to confuse the two. She looked out across the lawn to where the blue gown moved among the marquis's shadows, holding court. The world will tell you Miss Brandreth is a great lady and I am nothing. The world is often a fool. I try not to take its opinion of me too much to heart, and I try not to take its opinion of anyone else's, either. It is the only freedom a poor woman is allowed. I mean to keep it. Cuthbert looked at her, at the turned muslin, the mother's shawl, the hands that worked steadily on because they had never in their lives been permitted to be idle, and felt something in his chest that he had believed long since ossified give way with an almost physical pang. It was not pity. Pity would have been safe. This was closer to hunger and to fear, and to a kind of grief for all the years he had spent believing that no one behind any smile was ever anything but a creditor. You should go in, he made himself say. Your basket's empty. They'll want you at the tables. They'll want me nowhere near the tables while Miss Brandreth is at them. But she rose and settled the shawl and stood a moment looking down at him with that grave, considering warmth that undid him more thoroughly than any coquetry could have done. You've a kind heart under all that, quiet gardener, whatever you'd have the servants' hall believe. A man doesn't cross a lawn for a stranger unless he knows something of what it is to stand where she's standing. She hesitated and then said, more softly, come to the kitchen door this evening, when the fine folk are at their dancing and no one's counting. I'll bring the water. You needn't say a word if you don't wish to. Only, it's a long day for a person who keeps apart. It needn't be spent entirely alone. And she took up her empty basket and went, unhurried, up the kitchen path and did not look back, and left the Duke of Saberbury sitting on the cold stone lip of his own fountain with his shears idle in his hands and his heart going like a boy's. He should not go. He knew it with perfect clarity, even as he knew he would. Every hour he spent near her was an hour nearer the moment the coat came off, and she learned that the tired gardener she had pitied and pardoned was the very Duke whose house had entertained her humiliation. The master of the woman who had sneered at her mother's gown, the man at the top of the whole cruel order she had just told him she refused to bow to. She would not forgive that. Why should she? He had made himself a lie, and he was letting her be kind to the lie, and the longer he let her, the more surely he was building the ruin of the onest thing that had come to him in 20 years. He rose at last and gathered his barrow, and did not go back to the hedge. He stood instead in the lengthening shade of the cedar and watched the kitchen path where she had gone, and told himself quite firmly that he would not present himself at that door tonight. That a wise man would send word to Hollis to have the quiet gardener reassigned to the far orchards where temptation could not reach, that he would put the coat away and be a duke again, and let the poor schoolmaster's daughter from his lands unharmed by his folly. He knew, standing there as the feet's laughter drifted thin across the darkening lawns, that he would do none of it. That when the dancing began and the fine folk were counting nothing but their partners, he would be at the kitchen door in his stained fustian coat with his hat in his hands, waiting for a tin cup of water and the only voice that had ever asked him for nothing. The knowledge frightened him past all reason, and still he could not make himself sorry for it. He had spent his life unable to want anything he could not first mistrust. He wanted, now, only to keep talking to her, and it shook him to the ground of his being how entirely, how helplessly, and how much. He did not sleep that night, and he blamed the wind for it, though the wind had done nothing but move the elms as it always moved them. Long after the great house had gone dark, Cuthbert stood at the low window of the head gardener's cottage, where he had taken to lodging when the fancy for plain work first seized him, and he watched the black shapes of the hedges, and thought of a voice that had not once bent itself to flatter him. It was an unfamiliar affliction, this wakefulness. For 3 years he had prided himself on sleeping the untroubled sleep of a man who expected nothing of anyone, and now a girl who believed him a labourer had undone the whole arrangement with a cup of water and a plain reply. He rose before the servants, as was his habit in the disguise, and went out into the grey to be among the roses that needed no conversation. The dew soaked his cuffs to the elbow. He had chosen this, the ache in the back, the earth under the nails, the blessed anonymity of a broad hat and a labourer's coat precisely because it asked nothing of him but honest effort, and gave back nothing but the clean satisfaction of a thing well done. No one flattered a gardener. No one schemed for a gardener's hand or counted a gardener's acres. He had learned at cost exactly what his title was worth in the eyes of those who courted it, and he had decided that the garden was the one honest country left to him. She came at the usual hour along the path from the kitchen court, and he heard her before he saw her because she was humming low, unpolished, a tune he did not know. He kept his head down over the canes and let her come. "You are early," Eloan said, "or you never left." "A man sleeps where the work is," he answered, which was true and truer than she could guess. She set the jug down on the flat stone that had become, without either of them naming it, the place where the jug was set. "I brought 2 cups today," she said. It seemed unkind to drink in front of a man and give him none, and unkinder still to make him wait for it. He straightened at that, slower than he meant to, and found her already holding the second cup out to him. It was a small thing. He had been handed 1,000 cups in his life, on trays of chased silver, by hands gloved to the wrist, and not one of them had cost the giver a moment's thought. This one she had carried out of her own scant portion, because she could not bear to drink while another went dry. He took it, and their fingers did not touch, and he was aware of the not touching as a man is aware of a step he has not yet taken. "You will spoil me," he said. "You are too old to be spoiled, and too poor to be robbed," she said, "so I am safe on both counts." He laughed. It surprised him, the sound of it, rough with disuse. She looked up at the laugh as though she had won something and meant to keep the winning to herself, and the morning got a little brighter without the sun having anything to do with it. They worked, after that, in the easy silence of people who have found they need not fill the air to be at peace in it. She had no business among the canes, and yet she stayed, gathering the trimmings he cut away, stacking them without being asked, and he let her, because to send her off would have been to admit how little he wished her gone. Twice she caught a thorn and did not complain of it. Once she asked the name of a rose, and he told her the common name and not the Latin, because the Latin was the sort of thing a gardener might not know, and the small lie sat badly in him for the rest of the hour. "You speak better than your coat," she said at length, not unkindly, studying him over an armful of clippings. "There is a gentleman somewhere under all that dirt." His heart gave a single hard knock. "There was a schoolmaster," he said, who beat Latin and manners into me both, thinking to make me above my station. He succeeded only in making me unfit for it. A man who speaks too fine for his hands is trusted by no one. I trust you, she said simply, and returned to her clippings, and did not see what the words did to him. He asked her, then because he wanted to know, and because a labourer might ask a kitchen girl her circumstances without impropriety how she had come to the house. She told him without a shred of self-pity, which he had not expected, for he had heard 100 hard-luck tales in his life, and every one of them had been aimed like a coin held out for pity. Hers was aimed at nothing. Her father had kept a small shop in the market town, she said, a draper's, and had been an honest man and a poor one, which she had learned early were often the same. He had died of a fever the winter she turned 19, and the shop had gone to a cousin who had rights to it she did not understand and had not the money to dispute. Her mother had gone before that. There had been a young man, once, who had said pretty things and meant them only so long as her father's shop stood behind the pretty things. When the shop fell, the pretty things fell with it, and he had married a maltster's daughter within the 12-month. I do not tell it to be pitied, she added, as they had felt the shape of his silence and mistaken it. I tell it because you asked honestly, and I have found honesty is best answered in kind. I have my health and my hands, and a place that keeps me dry. There are a great many women who would count that riches, and I am not fool enough to be one who does not. And the young man, he heard himself ask, do you count him a loss? I count him a lesson, she said. It is cheaper than a loss and lasts longer. She smiled, but there was something behind the smile that had been paid for. He loved the shop and called it me. I did not know the difference until the difference was all that was left. I know it now. Whoever comes courting me next, if any fool ever does, will have to want the girl standing in front of him, with nothing behind her but a wall, or he shall not have her at all. The Duke of Sablebury stood among his roses with the earth cooling on his hands, and understood that she had just described, without knowing it, the precise wound he had carried for 3 years, and had made of it not a grievance, but a rule to live by. He had built a garden and a disguise to escape being loved for what stood behind him. She had built nothing, she had simply decided. And she asked no one's leave and wept for no one's sympathy, and it came upon him with the force of a thing long denied that he had never in his life met anyone he wished so entirely to know. He was a fool, Cuthbert said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it so. She looked at him a moment longer than she needed to. Then she gathered the last of the clippings and said the morning was getting on and the cook would want her, and she went, and he watched the whole length of the path until the kitchen court took her from him. He did not touch the roses again for an hour. He sat on the flat stone with the 2 cups beside him and thought about telling her not everything, not yet, but something. The beginning of a truth, a door left ajar. And then he thought of the maltster's daughter married within the 12-month. And of a name he did not let himself say even in the privacy of his own skull, a name that belonged to a woman who had loved the dukedom and worn his mother's ring for a season before he understood she had never once looked at the man wearing it. If he told Aloan who he was, he would never again know whether her kindness was for him or for the acres. The one clean thing he had found in 3 years would cloud the instant he named himself, and he could not bear to lose the water from her hand by turning it into a bribe she had not meant to give. So he said nothing, and the saying nothing became a weight he carried into the following days, and the following days were the happiest he could remember. She came each morning with the jug and 2 cups. He found reasons to work the beds nearest the kitchen path, and when the head gardener, who alone among the servants knew whose hands he truly obeyed, raised a careful eyebrow at the choice, the Duke returned him a look that ended the matter. They talked of small things and, through the small things, of everything, of her father's shop and the smell of new cloth, of the way a customer would run a bolt of muslin through her fingers to test it, and how her father had said you could know a person's whole heart by the way they handled what they could not afford. Of the tune she hummed which had been her mother's, and which she confessed she had never learned the words to and did not want to, for the words might spoil a thing that had done very well without them, of the way a rose will die back and come again stronger for the cutting, which she said was a hard comfort but a true one, and the only kind of comfort she had found that a person could lean on without its giving way. He told her what a gardener might truly know and no more, and the withholding grew harder each day, until it was less like keeping a secret and more like keeping a hand pressed over his own mouth. On the fourth evening he did a reckless thing. The house had a garden within the garden, a walled square with a fountain gone green at the lip, where his grandmother had grown herbs and his mother had grown nothing, and where no one now went because it was too far from the terrace for the guests and too fine for the servants to feel easy in. He knew it would be empty at dusk, told Aloin, when she came with the evening jug, that there was a thing worth seeing before the light went, and that a girl who loved the names of roses ought to see the old physic garden before it was let go entirely, and would she come? She hesitated, and he understood the hesitation and honored it. "It is not my place to be seen in the fine parts," she said. "No one is there to see," he said. "That is the whole of its virtue." She came. He led her through the low door in a wall, and the light was doing what the light does at that hour, going gold, and then rose along the tops of the espaliered piers, and she stopped just inside the door and made a small sound, and he watched her face and not the garden, and found the garden much improved by the arrangement. "Oh," she said. "Who let it go to this?" "A man who did not deserve it," he said. She walked the path slowly, touching the herbs, crushing a leaf of lemon balm between her fingers and holding it to her nose, naming what she knew and asking what she did not. And he told her the true names now, all of them, because in the failing light and the empty square it seemed suddenly a small and forgivable thing to know too much. The Latin came off his tongue like a confession. If she marked it, she said nothing. She only listened, and repeated the hard words after him and got them wrong, and laughed at herself getting them wrong, and he thought he had never heard a better sound, and was afraid of how much he wanted to hear it again. At the fountain she trailed her fingers in the green water and then, thinking better of it, drew them back and dried them on her apron with a rueful face, and a strand of her hair had come loose and lay against her cheek, and without deciding to, he reached and lifted it and put it back. His fingers grazed her temple. She went very still, he went stiller. The whole walled garden seemed to hold its breath with them, the fountain ticking, the lost light standing on the piers, and she looked up at him from very close. And he saw in her eyes that she felt the thing he felt, and was as unarmed against it as he, and for a long moment neither of them moved, and the little distance between them was the loudest thing in the world. "You should not," she said, barely aloud. "No," he agreed, and did not step back. "You do not know what I am," she said. "A kitchen girl. It would go badly for me and worse for you. A man in your place cannot. You do not know what I am either," he said low, and it was the nearest he had come to the whole truth, and it hung between them terrible and bright. She searched his face as though the answer were written on it in a hand she could nearly read. "Then tell me," she whispered, and he wanted to. God help him. He wanted to lay it all down at her feet in the gold light, and be for wanted or refused as the man he was and nothing else. But the fear of 3 years had teeth, and it closed on him, and he stepped back at last, and the light went of the moment as surely as if a cloud had crossed it. "Another time," he said. "There are things a man had rather earn than be given credit for. Let me be a while longer only what you have found me to be. It is the truest thing I have been in a great while." She did not understand him, how could she, but she was too kind to press what plainly cost him, and too proud to beg a second time. And she drew her shawl closer and said the light was gone and the cook would send someone, and they went out through the low door with the space between them charged and unspent. At the parting of the paths she stopped. "Whatever you are," she said, "and whatever you are not, I would have you know I didn't bring the water for thanks. I brought it because a man was thirsty and no one else would look at him. That is all it ever was. I should not like you to think me the sort who—" She stopped and lifted her chin. "I should not like you to think me angling after anything. I am not. I know it," he said, and his voice broke on the knowing, because it was the one thing in the world he had needed to be told and had never before been able to believe. "I know it better than you, and you know how much it is worth." She went. He stood in the near dark long after the kitchen court had swallowed the sound of her, and he was a man remade and terrified of the remaking, for he understood now that the disguise which had begun as an escape had become a trap of his own building. Each day he did not tell her was a day the telling would wound her the deeper. And there were others in the house who would not stay silent forever. Millicent Brandreth, who missed nothing that might be turned to her advantage, whose eyes had already begun to follow the kitchen girl with a cold and calculating interest, and the steward, who knew his master's face beneath the broad hat, and had begun to give him looks heavy with the question of how long this game would run. Somewhere ahead and not far, the truth was going to come out whether he willed it or no. He could tell her, and risk the water turning to a bribe in her memory, or he could wait and risk her learning it from a crueller mouth than his own and never forgiving the lie. He looked up at the great house, lamplit now, every window a life he had been born into and had never once chosen. Then he looked down the dark path toward the kitchen court, where a girl with nothing behind her but a wall had just walked away with asking him for a single thing. Soon, he said aloud, to no one, to the roses, to himself. It has to be soon. And he knew, standing there with the dew coming down again on his ruined cuffs, that he had already left it very nearly too late. The dawn came grey and unkind, and with it came the carriage he had not summoned. Cuthbert heard the wheels on the gravel before he saw them, and something in the sound set his teeth on edge, for no tradesman rolled up the West Drive at such an hour, and no guest of his own inviting would arrive uncelebrated. He was on his knees in the long border beneath the yews, his coarse coat dark at the shoulders with dew, a trowel forgotten in his fist, and he did not rise. A gardener did not rise for carriages. He had learned that much in the weeks he had worn this borrowed skin, and he had learned, too, that a man who kept his head bowed heard a great deal, that a duke was never permitted to hear. What he heard now was Millicent Brandreth's voice, pitched to carry, sweet as poisoned marchpane. There, she was saying to whoever attended her, you see how it is, let go. My cousin would weep to see the state of these beds. But then, one gets the gardening one pays for, and I am told this estate pays very little indeed. He did not look up. He pressed a seedling into the dark earth and firmed it with his thumb and waited, as he had taught himself to wait, and presently the gravel spoke again and the voices moved off toward the house. And he was left with the cold and the birds and the slow dread that had been gathering in him since the evening before, since Heroines. Since the dusk in the walled garden, when she had stood close enough that he might have counted the breaths between them, and had told him, without a scrap of pity for herself, exactly how narrow her life had grown and how she meant to bear it. He had come near to speaking then. The whole truth had risen in his throat like a tide. And he had swallowed it, coward that he was, because he could not yet bear to watch her face change, to watch the ease go out of it, and the careful courtesy of the poor come into it, and to lose forever the one creature in England who spoke to him as though he were merely a man. Now the carriage had come, and he did not know why, and he knew with a certainty that needed no reasoning that it had come for her. He found Osric at the pump behind the potting sheds, the old under-gardener who alone among the servants knew whose hands truly turned this soil, and who had kept the secret these 6 weeks with the grim loyalty of a man who had served 3 dukes and buried 2. The carriage, Cuthbert said. Whose? Mrs. Brandreth's own, your. Osric caught himself, glanced about, lowered his voice to a scrape. Her own, sir. Come up from the dower house with a great to-do. And there's talk in the kitchen already, sir. Ugly talk, and it's got the Ingalls name all through it. What talk? Osric would not meet his eye. That a brooch is gone from the morning room. A diamond thing, Mrs. Brandreth, she says, left on the mantel and now not there. And that Miss Ingle was seen in that room yesterday, dusting where she'd no cause to dust. He wiped his hands slowly down his apron. They've sent for the constable at Lyford, sir, and Mrs. Brandreth is with the steward this half hour, and she is not asking that the girl be turned off. She is asking that the girl be taken up. For a moment Cuthbert did not move at all. The pump dripped. A wren scolded from the wall. He was aware distantly of his own heartbeat, heavy and deliberate, and of a cold clarity settling over him that he had not felt since the courts and the councils and all the machinery of his rank had last been set in motion at his word. Heroines had been in that morning room because he had sent her there. He had contrived it himself, a fool's tenderness. He had left a book she had spoken of upon the mantel, an old volume of Cowper she had said her mother once owned and lost, and he had meant her to find it there as if by accident and think it a kindness of the house. She had gone into dust because the housekeeper bid her, and she had lingered, no doubt, over the book, and Millicent had seen it, and Millicent had understood in that swift, cruel way of hers that something in this house bent toward the girl, and she had set her trap accordingly. He knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that there was no brooch stolen. There was only Millicent, who had come to Sablebury to be its duchess and had watched, week upon week, the master of it grow strange and absent and unaccountably content, and who had at last traced that contentment to its root meant to tear the root out of the ground. "Where is she now?" he said. "Kept in the still room, sir, and Combe the steward standing at the door. They mean to have her before the constable when he comes." Osric hesitated. "Sir, you've but to say the word. You've but to walk up to that house and speak, and there's not a soul in the county would. I know what I have but to do," Cuthbert said, and heard the harshness in it and was sorry for it, for the old man had meant only kindness. He set his hand a moment on Osric's shoulder. "Forgive me. Say nothing, do nothing. Let me see her first." Because there was the whole of it, the thing that stopped him where a lesser reason never could. If he walked up to the great house now in his ruined coat and named himself before them all, he would save her in the same instant that he lost her. She would learn who he was in a courtyard full of frightened servants and a triumphant, unmasked Millicent, learn it as an accusation answered, a rescue performed, a debt she could never after set down. She would look at him and see not the man who had knelt beside her in the dirt and asked her honest questions and listened to her honest answers, but the Duke of Sablebury, her master, her creditor, the whole vast weight of a world that had only ever used her and might now, she would think, be using her still. Everything they had was built upon her knowing, and he understood at last, standing at that dripping pump, that the very disguise which had let him find her had become the thing most likely to destroy them both. He went in by the still room's low door, the one that gave onto the herb walk, and Combe the steward, who had orders to admit no one, and who did not for one instant recognize in this mud-stained labourer the man to whom he answered for every farthing of the estate, put out an arm and told him to be off. Cuthbert looked at him. He said nothing. He only looked, and perhaps something of what he was passed through the disguise despite him, for Combe faltered and then, muttering, stood aside, telling himself, no doubt, that the fellow was some friend of the girl's come to Gorp, and what harm. She was seated on the edge of a stool among the drying racks and the smell of tansy and rue, very straight, her hands folded in her lap, and she was not weeping. That was the thing that undid him. Any other woman he had ever known would have wept, or raged, or begun already to plead her cause in a torrent. Elowen sat with her chin level and her grey eyes steady, and when she saw who had come in she did not brighten with false hope nor crumple with shame. She only said quietly, "You ought not to have come. It will go the worse for you being seen to know me. You should think of your place." "My place," he said, and nearly laughed, and the laugh would have frightened her, so he did not. He crossed the little room and crouched before her stool as he had crouched 100 times beside her in the beds, so that he might look up into her face. "Elowen, tell me what they say you did." "That I took a brooch." She said it plainly, as one reports the weather. "Mrs. Brandreth's diamond spray. She says it stood on the morning-room mantel, and I was in that room, and now it is gone. I was in that room. There was a book left there, a book I had spoken of only to, well, it does not matter now to whom. I thought it left for me. I dare say that was vanity, to think anyone in this house would trouble over a thing for my sake, and vanity has its wages." Her mouth bent, not quite a smile. "I never touched a brooch. I never saw it. But I cannot prove I did not, and she is who she is, and I am who I am, and the constable will do as such men do." "You will not hang for a brooch," he said more roughly than he meant. "No," she agreed. "Transported perhaps if she presses it, and she will press it. Or gaol at the least, and after gaol no house in the country will take me, and then—" She stopped herself, and he watched her put the fear away as one puts a letter back in a drawer, unread because it cannot be borne. "I am sorry for it. Not for myself so much. I have been poor a long while, and has taught me that very little is truly needful. But my mother—" Her voice went, for the first time, unsteady. "My mother has none but me. If I am taken, she has none at all." Cuthbert, who had told himself for 6 weeks that he wore this disguise for his own protection, understood in that instant precisely how far he had been lying. He had worn it to be near her. He had worn it because in all the guarded years since his first betrothal had ended in a girl's cold confession that she loved his title and could learn in time to tolerate the man beneath it. Since that day he had believed himself unlovable, but for what he owned, and had shut his heart like a house before a storm. Elowen had opened the shutters without knowing there was a house there at all. And now the one truth that would save her was the one truth that might make her look at him the way that first girl had looked at him, measuring, calculating, seeing the rank and not the man. He took her folded hands in both of his. It was the first time he had ever touched her so, and he felt her go still, felt the rawness of her palms that were as work-worn as his own false ones, and he held them and did not let go. "Listen to me," he said. "I am going to tell you something, and I have not the time to tell it as it deserves to be told, and I am afraid, God help me, I am afraid of how you will look at me after. But you must hear it, because everything hangs upon it now." The still room door swung wide before he could go on. "How very affecting," said Millicent Brandreth from the threshold. She stood framed in the grey light with two people behind her and Coombe wringing his hands at her shoulder, and her gaze went from the girl's still face to the mud-stained labourer crouched at her feet with her hands in his, and a slow, satisfied comprehension curved her mouth. "So this is where the wind sits. The little drudge and the digging man. I confess I had wondered what so occupied our host that he could not spare a civil word for his guests these many weeks. I begin to think the fault was not in his temper but in his cultivation." She let the word sit, ripe with insinuation. "A pretty scene. It will make a prettier one before the constable. A thief and her follower, thick as thieves indeed." Cuthbert rose. He rose slowly, and he set himself between the women, and he was aware that his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and that the whole shape of his bearing had changed, that the stoop was gone from his shoulders and the deference was gone from his spine, and that Coombe, staring at him, had begun to go white about the lips as a man does who sees something he cannot yet let himself believe. "There is no brooch," Cuthbert said. His voice, when he chose, could fill a chamber. He did not raise it, and it filled the room regardless. "You have lost nothing, madam, because you brought nothing to lose but your malice. You have looked at a woman worth 10 of you, and you have found you cannot suffer her to exist unpunished, and so you have built a gallows out of air and a scrap of gossip and meant to hang her on it. I have watched you do it. I will not watch you finish." Millicent's chin went up. "You forget yourself extraordinarily, fellow. You forget to whom you speak." "No," he said. "You forget to whom you speak." For a heartbeat the whole room hung upon it. He felt Elowen's eyes upon his back, felt them like heat, and he knew that the next words out of his mouth would end one life of his and begin another, and that she would hear them not as he had dreamed of telling her, in some quiet hour with the truth laid gently down between them, but here, in a still room that smelled of rue, with his enemy watching her face for the profit to be had in her astonishment. He faltered. The name would not come. Not like this. Not stolen from her this way. And into that faltering silence came, from the courtyard beyond, the ring of a shod horse and a man's shout, and then Osric's voice, raised and cracking, and another voice with it. "The constables come up from Lyford at last." And Coombe stumbled to the door and out, and Millicent turned her head to the commotion, and the moment splintered. Cuthbert seized it. He bent to Elowen and spoke low and fast, for her alone. "Whatever you hear said in the yard, whatever is claimed of me, trust that I did not deceive you to wound you. I meant to keep you safe. I have made a ruin of it, but that was all I ever meant. Say nothing, admit nothing. Do not run." He pressed her hands once, hard. "I am coming back for you. Before the day is out, I swear it on my mother's grave, you will know the whole of it from my own mouth and not from theirs." "Know what?" she said, and there was for the first time real fear in it, not of Gale, he thought, but of him, of the strangeness that had come over the quiet gardener who now spoke like a magistrate and stood like a lord. "You frighten me. What have you done? Who are you?" He looked at her one long moment, and everything he was rose up behind his eyes, and still he could not rob her of it here, before Millicent, as a card played to win a hand. "A man who would sooner cut off his hand than see you harmed," he said. "That much is wholly true, whatever else you learn of me. Hold to that." Then Millicent turned back from the door, and her eyes, when they found him, had lost their triumph and gained something colder and far more dangerous, for she had had time to think in that turning. And she was not a stupid woman, and she had watched a digging man straighten into a muster and dared, at last, to believe her own eyes. "Coombe," she called, without looking away from Cuthbert, her voice gone silky and precise, "before you fetch the constable in, do come and tell me. This diligent labourer, this friend of thieves, what is his name, what is his true name, Coombe? For I begin to think the whole county has been made a fool of, and I should very much like to know by whom." Coombe stood in the doorway with the constable's shadow falling across him and his mouth working, and his terrified gaze went to Cuthbert and clung there, begging leave, begging orders, begging to be told what he might say. And Cuthbert, cornered at last in the small room with the woman he loved at his back and his enemy before him, and the law upon the threshold and the truth pressing at the door of his teeth like a thing alive, understood that the choosing was no longer his, it would out now. In the next breath, from Coombe's mouth or his own, it would out, and whether it saved her or lost her, whether she turned to him or from him, hung upon the single word the steward had not yet found the courage to speak. "Coombe," he said quietly, and the steward flinched as at a whip. "You need not be afraid." He held the man's eyes, and then he let his gaze travel once, deliberately, to Millicent, and once more slowly to Eloan, who had risen now from her stool and stood white and trembling with her hand pressed to her breast, staring at him as though the whole solid world had begun to shift beneath her feet. "Tell them," Cuthbert said. "Tell them all. It is past time." The travelling coach stood in the forecourt with its lamps already lit, and Cuthbert saw it from the shadow of the yew walk with the particular dread of a man watching a door close that he had waited his whole life to have opened. Eloan's small trunk was being handed up. She stood beside it in her grey travelling cloak, her chin level, her hands folded, bearing the thing they had done to her with the same steadiness she had once carried a tin cup of water across the gravel to a labourer no one else would look at. He had come out in his rough coat, the earth still under his nails, because he had run from the far garden the moment old Peverell brought him word, and there had been no time to be anything but the man she believed him to be. He should have spoken then. He knew it even as his feet failed him. But Millicent Brandreth was on the terrace above, radiant in dove silk, and her voice carried down the steps with the polished sweetness that had ruined a dozen lesser women before this one. "You must not weep, Fir Gardener," Millicent called, though Eloan had not wept. "A creature of her sort always lands somewhere, in a scullery most likely, which is where she was found. My uncle's household has no room for a girl who steals." The word struck the courtyard like a drop plate. Cuthbert felt it go through him, hot and sick. He had lived 9 years behind a wall of his own building, since the season a woman he had trusted had wanted the dukedom and not the man, and had said so, laughing, to her friends in a room she did not know he could hear. He had built the wall stone by stone and named it Wisdom. And in 3 weeks a girl who did not know his name had pulled it down without once reaching for it, simply by being kind to a man who could give her nothing. "I have taken nothing that was not mine," Eloan said. Her voice did not rise. "The brooch was my mother's. I have told you so, and it is the last time I shall." "Then produce the woman who can swear it," said Millicent, descending now, her gloved hand trailing the balustrade, her allies clustering behind her like a tide coming in. There was Lady Fenmore with her lorgnet and the Crail sisters who laughed when Millicent laughed, and the steward Harbottle, who had found the brooch in Eloan's box because Millicent had told him precisely which box to search. "Produce her, and I shall beg your pardon before the whole house." "But you cannot, for she is dead, and the dead make convenient witnesses. My uncle will hear that his charity was repaid with theft, and the magistrate will hear it after him." Cuthbert saw the flicker cross Eloan's face then, not fear for herself, he understood, but the older, deeper grief of being disbelieved by people who had decided the verdict before the trial. She had told him about the brooch 2 nights ago in the potting shed, turning it in the lamplight, her thumb over the worn place where her mother's thumb had worn it first. He had held it. He had felt the truth of it in her hands the way a man feels the grain of honest wood. She did not steal it. The words were out of him before he had chosen them, and rougher than he meant, a gardener's words flung up at a lady. "I have seen the brooch. She has had it since before she came to this house." Any man with eyes could see it was no lady's ornament. The pin is mended with common wire. Millicent turned to him as though a hedge had spoken. For a moment her beautiful face simply could not arrange itself around the impertinence. Then it hardened. You forget yourself entirely, she said. You will be turned off for this, and gladly. Who do you imagine will take the word of a man who digs holes over the word of a lady of this house? And Cuthbert felt something in him go very still and very cold, the old ducal stillness he had not worn in weeks, and he understood that the wall he had pulled down had after all left him one last stone, and that the moment to set it had come. He looked at Eloin. She was watching him with an expression he would carry to the end of his days, not hope, for she had learned not to hope from people above her, but a kind of quiet sorrow on his behalf, as though she were sorry that his goodness would cost him his place. She thought he was throwing away his living for her. She did not yet know he owned the ground they stood on. No one, Cuthbert said quietly, no one will take the word of a man who digs holes over the word of a lady. You are quite right, Miss Brandreth. Millicent's mouth curved. But they will take mine, he said, and he straightened, and he let the labourer fall from his shoulders like a coat set down, and he was all at once and unmistakably the man the whole county feared. The change in him silenced the courtyard more surely than any shout. It was in the spine and the level of the head and the way the eyes, which had been a servant's careful eyes, now rested on Millicent Brandreth without the smallest deference in them at all. Old Peverell, on the step, took off his hat. Harbottle the steward had gone the colour of ash. You do not know me, Cuthbert said, and his voice had changed too, low and even and carrying to every corner of the forecourt. That is my own doing, and until this hour I counted it among the pleasanter successes of my life. I came home in the spring to bury my mother, and I found this house so full of people eager to flatter the Duke of Sablebury that I could not hear myself think. So I put on an old coat and took up a spade in the far garden, where no one of consequence ever walks, and I have lived these weeks as the one thing a great house never troubles to see. It was a great deal more restful than being myself. You lie, Millicent breathed, but the certainty had drained out of her and left only the shape of the words. I am Cuthbert Sablebury. He said the name without weight, which made it heavier. This is my house. That is my forecourt your coach is standing in. And you have been my guest at the invitation of your uncle, whom I permit to steward the eastern farms for 1 month, during which time I have watched you do to a good and honest woman precisely what was once done to me, decide a person's whole worth by what she could not give you, and then punish her for it with a smile. Lady Fenmore's lorgnette came down slowly. The Crail sisters had stopped breathing. Millicent Brandreth stood on the second step from the bottom with one hand still on the balustrade, and Cuthbert watched the calculation run behind her eyes, watched her cast about for the flattery that had always saved her, and find that it had nowhere to land. Your Grace, she began, and her voice climbed toward its sweetest register. If I had known, you must see how it looks. A stranger, a girl of no family, alone with the men of the garden at all hours. Mind what you say next, Cuthbert said, so gently that it stopped her cold. I have heard every word you have said to her since you came, Miss Brandreth. In the rose walk on the day of the garden party, when you told her that a woman of her station should be grateful to be looked at, I was 6 feet from you on my knees in the border, and you did not see me, because a man with earth on his hands is furniture to you. I heard you name her plain. I heard you name her poor as though poverty were a crime she had committed against you personally, and this evening I have heard you name her thief, on evidence you manufactured, before witnesses you flatter into agreement. He turned his head. Harbottle. The steward flinched as though struck. You searched Miss Ingle's box. Who told you where to look? The silence stretched. Harbottle's eyes went to Millicent and away again, and that flick of the eyes was answer enough for every soul in the courtyard. But Cuthbert waited, and the weight of his waiting was such that the man broke. Miss Brandreth, your Grace, Harbottle said, barely above a whisper. She said, she told me the brooch would be in the 3rd box, under the linen. She knew the very place. I did not think how she should know it, your Grace. God forgive me, I did not think. You did not think, Cuthbert agreed. Because thinking was not what you were paid for. He let his gaze travel over them all then, the whole polished company, Lady Fenmore and the Crail sisters and the two young men who had laughed at Millicent's wit all month and were now studying the gravel as though it held their salvation. You knew where the brooch was, Miss Brandreth, because you put it there. A woman does not steal her own mother's keepsake, but a lady may take it from an unlocked box and hide it, and find it again with witnesses, and call it justice, if she is quite certain no one who matters is watching. He came forward out of the shadow of the yews at last into the lamplight, and he saw Elowen see him fully for the first time, not the change of manner only, but the whole terrible truth of who he was, and he made himself hold her eyes while he said the rest, because she of all of them deserved to hear it to her face. I was watching, he said. I have been watching all along, and I have seen nothing in these gardens this spring so fine as the woman you have spent a month trying to grind into the dust. Millicent Brandreth's composure broke at last. It did not break into tears, which might have moved someone. It broke into fury, the ugliness under the silk showing through the way a rotten sill shows through fresh paint. You would take her part, she said, and her voice had lost all its music. A nobody. A girl who carries water. You are the Duke of Sablebury, and you would shame your own guests before the whole house for a servant who does not even know how to curtsy properly. She knew how to bring a thirsty man water when no one was looking, Cuthbert said. That is the only accomplishment I have ever found worth the name. You have a great many others, and I have watched every one of them, and I would not trade 1 hour of her company for the whole of your season. He turned from her as though she had ceased to exist, which, in the only way that had ever mattered to Millicent Brandreth, she now had. You will be gone from Sablebury by morning, you and your uncle both. Peveril will see the coach loaded. This one, that stands ready. It seems a pity to waste the horses. A sound went through the watching servants, quickly stifled, that in a coarser house would have been a cheer. Millicent looked about her once, at the faces that had laughed with her all month and would not now meet her eyes, at Lady Fenmore already drawing her shawl tight in the universal gesture of a woman removing herself from an association gone bad. And Cuthbert, who had once stood in just such a ring of averted faces, felt no triumph in it, only a weary recognition of how cheaply such friends are bought and how fast they are spent. He did not watch her go up the steps. He had spent enough of his life watching that particular retreat. He had eyes only for Elowen now, and Elowen was looking at the space where the labourer had stood as though a man she had known had died there. Your Grace, she said, and the two words were a wall going up, brick by brick, faster than he could have believed. The same wall he himself had lived behind for 9 years, and he understood with a lurch of pure fear that he had won her freedom and might in the same breath have lost every other thing. Elowen. He had never once called her by her name aloud, only turned it over in the dark like a coin he had no right to spend, and to say it now in the hearing of the whole house was itself a kind of confession. Elowen, wait. You let me speak to you as an equal. She was very pale. In the potting shed, by the water butt, I told you things I have told no living soul. I gave you the brooch to hold, I thought. She stopped, and he watched her force the steadiness back into her voice at a cost he could see. I thought you were a poor man, and it made you safe to be kind to. And all the while you were the greatest man in the county, taking my measure. I was not taking your measure. He took a step toward her, and she did not retreat, which he chose to count as mercy. I had done taking men's measure years ago. I knew the whole art of it, and it had made me wretched. Elowen, I did not keep the coat on to deceive you. I kept it on because you were the first person in 9 years who spoke to me as though I were a man and not a title, and I could not bear to give it up. Every morning I told myself I would tell you the truth. Every morning you came across the gravel with the water, and looked at me the way you look at a person, and I could not. His voice went unsteady, a thing it had not done before witnesses in his adult life, and he let it. I was a coward. Only there, only with you. Because you were the one thing I had that was true, and I knew the moment I said the word Duke it would go the way of everything else. The coach horses stamped. Somewhere a lamp guttered. Elowen stood with her mother's brooch. Harbottle had surrendered it, ashen, into her hands, pressed against her heart, and she looked at him for a long moment with the whole of her honest, weighing gaze, the gaze that had never once in a month flattered him or feared him, and Cuthbert found that he was holding his breath like a boy. You said the pin was mended with common wire, she said at last unevenly. You remembered that, from 2 nights past in the lamplight. I remember everything you have ever said to me, he answered. It is the great trouble of my life at present. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not yet a smile, but was no longer a wall, and it undid him more completely than any embrace could have done. But before he could reach her, before he could say the one plain thing that had been climbing in his chest since the coach lamps were lit, old Peverell came hurrying across the forecourt with a face full of alarm, and the moment shattered. Your Grace, Miss Ingle, forgive me. The old man was breathless. The carrier. Your box, miss, and your character reference from Mrs. Loam. They've gone up on the mail already before all this. The boy took your trunk to be sent on to the coaching in not 10 minutes since, thinking you dismissed, and the mail does not wait. If you're to stop it, Your Grace, if she's to have her own things and not lose her place at the Fenwick house that's expecting her by Thursday, someone must ride now this minute, or it's gone to Ludborough and lost a week, and Cuthbert saw the whole of it in an instant. That her small life had machinery of its own that did not stop for a duke's revelation, that her every possession and the reference that was her only fortune were rattling away into the dark on a cart while they stood here, and that if he let a single servant handle it she would spend the night believing herself still in the end, a thing to be managed by other people, did not send a servant. Peverell, my horse, no, there is no time. He was already moving, already past her, already at the black hunter that a groom had left saddled by the mounting block, and he swung up into the seat with the earth still under his nails, and the rough coat still on his back, Duke and Gardner at once and the first time, neither ashamed of the other. He gathered the reins and wheeled the horse about, and for one held breath he looked down at Eloan Ingalls standing in the lamplight with her mother's brooch at her heart, and the beginning of that not yet smile still trembling on her mouth. Wait for me, he said, not commanded, asked, a duke asking, which no one in that courtyard had ever heard him do. Eloan, whatever else is true, wait for me. I will bring back your things and everything else I have to say, and I will say it properly this time, hat in hand, as a man ought. Only wait, and without waiting himself to hear whether she would, 'cause he could not have borne to be refused and could not have borne to lose the mail, he put his heels to the hunter and went down the avenue at a gallop, out under the great gates into the falling dark. The fastest and freest and most frightened he had been in the whole of his guarded life, racing a carrier's cart along the Ludborough road to save the few poor treasures of the only woman who had ever brought him water. The gravel of the long drive tore beneath his boots, and Cuthbert did not slow for it. He had not run since he was a boy, had schooled himself for 20 years into the measured stillness that great men wore like armour, and now that armour lay abandoned somewhere behind him on the terrace, dropped with the pruning gloves and the stained coat and the false name he had hidden inside for a whole summer. The carrier's cart was already at the gate. He could see the top of Eloan's bonnet above the low box of it, and the small trunk beside her that held, he knew, the whole of what she owned in the world, and the sight of that trunk did something to his chest that no ledger of losses ever had. Miss Ingle. His voice cracked across the gap between them, and half the household heard it, and he found he did not care. Eloan, stop the cart. The carrier drew rein out of plain instinct, for a duke's command carries even when the duke is out of breath and hatless. Eloan turned on the seat. Her face, when it came round to him, was not soft. It was pale and composed and terribly quiet, the face of a woman who had already spent every tear she meant to spend, and was determined to spend no more before strangers. That composure undid him more than weeping would have. She had worn that same look bearing Millicent Brandreth's cruelties in the Rose Walk, and he had admired it then as one admires a thing seen from a distance. He could not admire it now. Now it was aimed at him. Your Grace. She inclined her head the exact degree that station required, no more, and the courtesy was a door closing. You need not have troubled yourself to come out. I am told the road is quick to the village. I have troubled myself very little these 30 years, he said. Grant me the one occasion. He came up to the side of the cart. Behind him, faintly, he was aware of the terrace filling, the guests spilling from the long windows, Millicent among them with her painted composure in ruins, the steward, the footman, the gardeners who had ignored him all summer, and now stared as though the earth itself had spoken. Let them stare. He had spent his life being watched and never once being seen. He put his hand on the rough rail of the cart, close to hers but not touching, and he lowered his voice so that it was for her alone. "You knew me as Cuthbert," he said. "Only that." A man in a labourer's coat who could not name the half of what he pretended to prune. "You brought me water when the sun was high, and no one else in this house would carry a cup to a working man. You spoke to me as if my thoughts were worth the hearing. Do you know what a rare thing that is, to be spoken to so? I did not, until you did it. I had forgotten there was such a thing in the world." Her jaw tightened. "And it was a game?" "No." The word came out harder than he meant, and gentler after. "No. Hear me, and then send me off if you will, and I shall stand in the drive and watch you go, and it will be no less than I have earned. It began as a retreat, not a game. My father died and left me this house and 40 tenants and a title that men bow to before they know whether I am cruel or kind. And I found Eloan. I found I could not tell any longer who came to me for myself, and who came for the coronet. Every smile at my table had a price behind it. Every kindness was an investment. I grew so weary of being courted that I stopped believing kindness was a thing that could exist without a bill to follow. So I put on an old coat and went down among the beds where no one looks twice at a man with dirt on his hands, and I meant to hide there a fortnight and rest. That is all. I did not mean to find you. You might have told me." Her voice wavered for the first time, and she mastered it. "Any morning of 100 mornings, you might have told me, and instead you let me." She stopped, her hands twisted in her lap. "You let me pity you. I lay awake worrying whether the gardener had enough to eat, whether his cottage kept out the rain. I saved the better half of my own supper more nights than I will say, and carried it down wrapped in a cloth, because I thought you were poorer than I, and I have next to nothing. Do you understand how that sits with me now? You could have bought the village twice over while I fretted for your bread." He had known she was proud. He had not known the shape her pride would take when it turned, and it was this, not that she had been deceived, but that her care had been received under false colours, that she had given from her scarcity to a man who wanted for nothing. It was the cleanest reproach he had ever been handed, and he bowed his head to it. "Every supper you carried down," he said quietly, "I ate, not because I hungered, because you had touched it. I have dined off gold plate my whole life and tasted nothing so well as bread you had folded in a cloth with your own hands and worried over. If that is a sin, I will answer for it to my last day. But do not tell me your care was wasted. It was the only thing in 20 years that reached me." The carrier, red-eared and desperate to be anywhere else, studied the ears of his horse. On the terrace a woman's voice, Millicent's, rose in some brittle attempt to reclaim the moment, and was hushed by those around her, for even her allies had understood at last which way the wind had turned, and no one wishes to be seen beside the fallen favourite. Cuthbert did not so much as glance back. There would be a reckoning there, and it would be public, and it would be soon. But it was not this. This was hers. "You should go up to them," Eloan said, following the sound. "She will be telling everyone she meant no harm, that it was jest, that I misheard. She is very good at it." "She is very good at it," he agreed. "She has had years of practice on softer targets than you. When I go up, and I will go up, every soul on that terrace is going to hear from my own mouth that the woman who mocked you at my table did so believing she flattered its master, and that she was wrong on every count that matters. She courted a coronet. You brought a cup of water to a man she would not have crossed the lawn to look at. The whole of Sablebury will know by nightfall which of you I found worth the name of lady." He paused. "But I did not run down this drive with my heart in my mouth to settle scores with Millicent Brandreth. I ran because you were leaving, and I could not bear the world with you gone out of it." She looked at him then, truly looked, the composure trembling at its edges. "You are the Duke of Sablebury," she said, as if trying the shape of it and finding it too large for her mouth. "Do you hear how it sounds? A duke standing in the road saying such things to a woman who has donned the same 2 gowns for 3 winters. There is not a person on that terrace who would believe it kindness. They would call it a fancy, a summer's madness. And when it passed you would be a duke still, and I would be a girl who had let herself be made a fool of twice by the same man. Then I will say it in a way that cannot be mistaken for a fancy." He drew a breath. His hands, he noticed distantly, were not quite steady, these hands that had signed away fortunes without a tremor. Marry me. The word fell into the summer stillness and lay there. The carrier's horse shifted its weight. Somewhere on the terrace a cup met a saucer and rang like a small bell into the quiet. I am not asking a labourer's sweetheart to overlook a title. Cuthbert went on faster now, before his courage or her pride could shut the moment. I am asking Eloan Ingle, who saw a man where no one troubled to look, to have that man, coronet and all, for she cannot have the one without the other, and God knows I have tried these 3 days to think of a way to offer her only the part she liked. I would give up the title if it were mine to give. It is not, it belongs to the tenants and the name and the dead, but everything of me that is truly mine to give, that is yours, and has been since the first hot afternoon you knelt in the dust to fill a cup for a stranger. I do not want to be married for Sablebury. That is the whole of my terror and always has been. You are the one soul alive who cannot be marrying me for it, because you did not know I had it. Do you see? You are my proof. You are the proof I stopped believing existed. For a long moment she said nothing, and he stood there in the ruin of his dignity and let her weigh him, and it was the longest silence of his life. Then her hand, the small, work-roughened hand that had carried 100 cups down 100 paths, turned over on her knee and opened, palm up, an inch above the rough rail where his own rested. It was not quite a touch. It was an offer of one. He understood it as he had learned to understand all her plainest, truest things, and he laid his hand over hers, and her fingers closed, and the whole clamouring summer went silent in him at once. I did not weep for the gardener's poverty alone, she said very low, so that it was still only theirs. I wept a little some nights, that a man so gentle should have so little, and that I could give nothing but bread and an hour's talk over the beds. It seemed the smallest of gifts. If you tell me now it was not small, it was not small, he said. It was the whole world. It is the world I am asking to keep. Then yes. She said it simply, without ornament, the way she said everything, and it was worth more from her mouth than any oath sworn in any chapel he had ever knelt in. Yes, Cuthbert, not the Duke, the man who ate the bread. I will have him. And I find her voice broke at last, and the tears she had refused to spend before strangers came now quietly, and she did not try to stop them. I find the Duke is only the same man wearing a better coat, and I am not so frightened of a coat. He lifted her down from the cart. He did it as he had done nothing in years, without a thought for who watched, and the small trunk with all her worldly goods stayed forgotten on the boards, and she came down into the drive, and he did not let go of her hand. Behind them the household had gone utterly still. And then somewhere among the gardeners a rough cheer went up. Old Tobias, who had worked these grounds 40 years, and had shared his flask with the queer, quiet fellow labouring beside him all summer, without ever guessing, and the cheer was caught up by another and another, until the men who tended Sablebury's earth were calling their gladness across the lawn, while the fine guests on the terrace stood mute and elegant and entirely out of place in their own theatre. Cuthbert turned to that terrace at last, Eloan's hand fast in his, and walked her up the long steps between the roses she knew every one of by name. Millicent Brandreth stood at the top in her ruined splendour, and her face when they reached her was a study, the calculation still running behind her eyes even now, still hunting for the phrase that would turn the whole afternoon back to her advantage. "Cuthbert," she began, "you cannot think that anything I said in play. Miss Brandreth." He stopped before her, and the courtesy of the address was itself a blade, for he had never before denied her his given name in company. "You have been a guest under my roof a great many times. You will not be again. This morning, believing yourself to be flattering the master of this house, you called Miss Ingle a beggar who had crept in to eat above her station, and you invited these good people to laugh, and some of them did. I was standing 3 feet from you with earth on my hands, and you did not see me, because you never once in all your visits troubled to look at the man in the garden. That is the whole of your failing, and it is the whole of her virtue." She looked. "Go home. And when you tell this tale in the drawing-rooms of the county, as you will, be sure to tell it true, for I mean to tell it everywhere myself, and I should hate for our accounts to differ." Millicent's mouth opened and closed. There was nothing in it. She gathered the tatters of her dignity and swept down the far steps to her carriage, and not one soul on that terrace moved to detain her or to follow, and that the silence of her own allies was a more complete humbling than any word of his could have wrought. Cuthbert did not watch her go. He had already turned back to Alohan, and to him the whole business of Millicent Brandreth had already ceased to exist, the way a shadow ceases when one finally faces the sun. They were married before the leaves turned in the small grey church at the edge of the estate, and he would not have it grander, though he might have filled a cathedral. Tobias and the garden men stood in the front pews in their Sunday coats, awkward and beaming, on the side that custom kept for the family, because Cuthbert had asked it and Alohan had wept with gladness at the asking. She wore no jewels she had not chosen herself, which were few, and she carried roses from the walk she had tended, and when the old parson asked whether he, Cuthbert, Duke of Sablebury, would take this woman, the Duke's voice did not once falter, though it had faltered in the drive when it mattered most, and she smiled at him because she remembered. Afterward, on the church step, he found a plain earthenware cup set into her free hand. Tobias's doing. The old gardener read to the ears and grinning, and Cuthbert understood the jest and laughed aloud. A sound the house had not often heard from him, and drank, and passed it to his wife. And she drank after him, and the whole of that small congregation seemed to hold its breath at the sweetness of it. There was more said in that shared cup than in all the vows, and every labourer on the step knew it, and so did she, and so at last did he. The years that came after were long and good, and they were the making of the guarded man. He learned to be seen without flinching from it, because there was one pair of eyes that had never wanted anything from him but himself, and a house looks different when one is not braced against it. The tenants found their Duke changed, quicker to the cottage door in a hard winter, slower to judgment, a man who knew the weight of a full water jug carried up a hot path, because he had once been the man it was carried to, and if the county gossips had at the first whispered that his grace had married beneath him and would repent it, they lived to eat every word, for there was never a mistress of Sablebury more loved by those who served it, nor a wife more plainly cherished by her husband, and love that plain shames gossip into silence in the end. He came upon her, one late afternoon of their first married autumn, kneeling in the dust of the very bed where he had first knelt in his labourer's coat, her sleeves pushed back and her hands in the earth, coaxing a late root into the ground for the spring. He stood a moment in the low gold light and only watched her. This woman everyone in his brilliant, blind world had walked past without a glance, and the old ache of being unseen came up in him one last time and dissolved entirely, for she felt his eyes as she always did and looked up and smiled, and held out one earth-dark hand to him the way she had that first hot day, palm open, an offer of a touch. He knelt down beside her in the dirt, the Duke of Sablebury, in no coat that mattered, and took the hand she offered and did not let it go.